9 days. That's how long the baby had been crying. Not whimpering, not fussing. Crying, the kind that peeled through walls and settled inside your chest like something broken. The kind that didn't belong to hunger or cold or a wet diaper. The kind that belonged to grief. And nobody in the Vale Syndicate penthouse could make it stop. Caliph Rowan heard it through the ventilation shaft above the kitchen sink. Every night. Every single night. From the moment the lights in the estate dimmed to the moment the city outside the harbor windows turned gray with early morning. He'd stand at his prep station, hands still, ears full of that sound, and something in his body would pull tight, like a cord being wound too far. He didn't understand it. He wasn't supposed to understand it. He was the kitchen omega, the quiet one. The one who wrote notes on a small spiral pad instead of speaking, who moved through the estate like a shadow with soft shoes, who knew exactly which hallways to avoid when the three kings were in a bad mood. He kept his head down. He kept his hands busy. He stayed invisible. That was the job. That was survival. But the crying wouldn't let him be invisible anymore. On the 9th night, a pot of broth sat burning on the back burner because Caliph had stopped stirring. His eyes were fixed on the ceiling. His jaw was locked, because that sound, it had changed. It wasn't just desperate now. It was exhausted. A child crying past the point where crying makes sense. A child crying because stopping felt more frightening than continuing. Caliph knew that feeling. He turned off the burner, pressed both hands flat against the counter. Breathed. Hi viewers. Have you ever felt a pull toward something you couldn't explain? Like your body understood something your mind hadn't caught up to yet? Drop your answer in the comments. I want to know. Down the hall, inside the estate's private east wing, 3 men stood around a crib that cost more than most people made in a year, and none of them could do a single thing. Driven Vale, the eldest, stood closest to the window. His arms were crossed. His jaw was tight. He'd called in 2 pediatric specialists, 1 neonatal sleep consultant, and a developmental psychologist flown in from Boston. Every single one of them had said the same thing after hours of examination. The baby is healthy. Driven had stared at each of them with the same flat, dangerous expression. And each of them had been escorted out of the building before dinner. Cedric Vale stood near the door with a tablet in his hand. Second born. The analytical one. He'd been cross-referencing infant behavioral studies for 4 days straight. He hadn't slept in 36 hours. His eyes were red at the edges, but his face showed nothing. He was reading, always reading, looking for the variable that everyone else had missed. Valer Vale was pacing, youngest of the 3 and the least patient on a good day. His suit jacket had been thrown across the rocking chair 2 hours ago. His tie was loose. His hands were moving, gesturing at nothing, cutting through air, because he needed to do something and there was nothing to do. There has to be a reason, Valer said. Not for the first time. There is a reason, Cedric answered, eyes still on the tablet. We haven't identified it yet. That's not helpful, see? It's accurate. I don't need accurate. I need the baby to stop. The baby cried louder, as if in response, as if it heard its own name in the argument and answered. Valer stopped pacing. Driven turned from the window. Cedric lowered the tablet. The head nurse, Mirasalis, appeared in the doorway. She'd been managing the rotating team of caretakers who had each tried and failed and gone home shaken. Her face was calm in the way that nurses train themselves to be calm, the mask of professionalism over the reality of being at a complete loss. We've tried the warming pad, the white noise, the swaddle changes, the motion bassinet. She paused. He's not responding to any of it. Then try something new, Driven said, quiet, even, the kind of voice that didn't need to be loud to be heard in every corner of a room. Mira hesitated. There's... She stopped, started again. There's someone who's been standing outside this hallway for the past 2 nights. One of the kitchen staff. Another pause. He's never said anything. He just stands there. And every time he passes this door, the crying seems to. She searched for the word. Pause. Valor made a sound low in his throat. But Driven didn't dismiss it. Bring him in. 3 minutes later, Caliph Rowan stood in the doorway of the nursery with his spiral notepad pressed against his chest like a shield. He was smaller than they'd expected, younger looking than his file suggested. His eyes moved fast, cataloging the room, the men, the crib, and then settled on the baby. The crying was unbearable up close, but Caliph didn't flinch. He stepped forward slowly, pulled the notepad from his chest, wrote something, held it up toward Driven. Driven read it aloud because he was closest. The sound he's making isn't pain. It's searching. The room went still. Valor opened his mouth. Driven held up one hand. Let him try. Mira moved first. She lifted the infant carefully, this small red-faced furious child, and carried him toward Caliph. The crying spiked at the movement, violent and ragged. Caliph held out both arms. His hands were shaking. The baby was placed against his chest, and the crying stopped. Not faded, not slowed down. Stopped. Completely. Immediately. Like someone had pressed a button that no one else in the room knew existed. The baby's tiny fingers found the fabric of Caliph's shirt and gripped it. His small chest rose and fell. Once, twice, and then the heir of the Veil Syndicate, the child that 3 of the most powerful men in the city could not comfort, closed his eyes. Nobody spoke. Nobody moved. Until Mira whispered, barely audible, "That's not supposed to be possible." And then the moment fractured, because Valor reached over instinctively, just to check the child's face, to confirm what he was seeing was real, and his hand brushed the baby's ankle. The crying came back, violent, immediate, louder than before. Caliph pulled the child back against his chest. Silence again. Every person in that room understood at the same moment what that meant. The baby didn't just prefer the Omega. The baby would not accept anyone else. Driven looked at Caliph for a long moment. His expression was unreadable. His voice, when he finally spoke, was measured and low. "You're staying in this wing tonight." It wasn't a question. Caliph looked down at the sleeping child in his arms. Then he nodded once. But what no one noticed, not the nurses, not the kings, not even Caliph himself, was the way the baby's scent changed the moment he was held. The faint chemical shift that moved through the room like a current. Cedric noticed. He didn't say anything yet, but his eyes moved to his tablet, and he started a new search. They gave Caliph a chair. Not a room, not a bed. A chair, a wide-cushioned armchair pulled close to the crib, and a blanket that one of the nurses folded and left on the armrest without making eye contact. That was the arrangement. That was what the kitchen Omega got in exchange for being the only person who could keep the Veil heir from tearing the estate apart with the sound of his grief. Caliph didn't complain. He didn't complain about anything. He never had. He sat through the night with the baby resting against his chest, one hand curled around the small warm weight of him, listening to the city outside the tall windows. Harbor lights moved across the water. Somewhere below, a security rotation changed shifts. The estate breathed in the way large buildings breathe, with distant footsteps and settling pipes and the low hum of systems designed to keep powerful people comfortable. Orion slept. That was what they called him. Orion Vale. The name had been chosen before the baby was born. Driven had chosen it, and it sat on the birth announcement in the estate office, unposted, waiting. Because you don't announce an heir who won't stop crying. Not in this world. Not when weakness is currency and enemies are always watching. But in Caliph's arms, Orion slept like the name already fit him, like he'd found his place in the world and had no intention of leaving it. Mira came in at 3 in the morning. She stood in the doorway for a moment before she spoke. "Do you need anything?" Caliph shook his head. She stepped in anyway. checked the baby's temperature with a soft forehead strip, made a note on her clipboard, then stood for a moment, not quite ready to leave. "I've worked in this estate for 4 years," she said, keeping her voice low. "I've seen a lot of things I couldn't explain." A pause. "This is the first time I've been genuinely at a loss." Caliph looked at her. His expression was open, not guarded the way it usually was in the main corridors of the estate, where invisibility was strategy. He reached for his notepad with his free hand, wrote carefully so as not to disturb the baby. Mira leaned in to read it. He just needed someone who wasn't afraid of him. She straightened slowly. "Read it again," then looked at Caliph with something shifting behind her professional composure. "You're not afraid of him." Caliph shook his head. "Most people are," she said quietly. "Even the ones who don't admit it. A baby born into this family carries a weight that people feel before they understand it. Everyone who walks in here has already decided he's complicated." She almost smiled. "You walked in here and just held him." Caliph glanced down at the baby. Then he wrote one more line on the notepad. Mira read it. She didn't respond right away. The line said, "Complicated things just need more patience, not less." She left without another word, but she took a long time closing the door. Morning came gray and slow over the harbor. Driven arrived at 6:15. Caliph heard him before he saw him. The particular cadence of expensive shoes on marble, the pause before the door opened that told you the person on the other side was used to waiting for everyone else to wait for them. He came in alone. No security. No assistant. He stood at the far side of the room and looked at the crib for a moment, and then at Caliph in the chair beside it. Orion was awake now, quiet and alert, fingers still curled loosely around the edge of Caliph's shirt. Small dark eyes looking up at nothing and everything. Driven crossed the room, looked down at his son. He reached into the crib slowly, careful, like a man who had learned precision in rooms where mistakes cost lives and was now applying that same precision to something entirely different. His finger grazed Orion's hand. The baby looked at him, didn't cry, didn't reach, just looked. Driven's expression didn't change, but something moved behind his eyes. A current of something that men like him rarely let surface. He straightened, looked at Caliph directly. "He cried when Valor touched him last night." Caliph nodded. "He's not crying now." Caliph looked down at the baby, considered, then wrote on the notepad and held it up. "You came in quiet." He could feel the difference. Driven read it, said nothing for a long moment. "You think he can feel intent." Caliph wrote, "I think he can feel everything. He just can't filter it yet." Driven studied him, the way he studied everything, with the full weight of attention that powerful men gave to things they hadn't yet decided how to categorize. "How long have you worked in this estate?" Caliph wrote, 7 months. "And before that?" A pause. Caliph wrote, "Different places." Driven heard what was behind that. People who've survived learn how to answer questions with the shape of an answer and none of the content. He recognized it because he'd done it himself. He didn't push. Instead, he looked back at Orion. The baby had started to drift again, heavy-lidded in the warmth of Caliph's hold. "He needs to eat," Driven said. "The formula, he's been rejecting it. He'll take a few ounces and then pull away. The nutritionist says he's losing weight." Caliph went very still. He looked at the baby, then up at Driven. His hand moved to the notepad slowly, like he was deciding something. Like he was standing at a door and hadn't decided yet whether to open it. He wrote, handed it to Driven. The eldest Vale King read the note. His expression did not change, but he read it twice, and then a third time. He set the notepad down carefully on the arm of the chair. "I'll get Mira," he said. He left without looking at Caliph again. And Caliph sat with the weight of what he'd just offered, what he'd just made real by writing it down. and pressed his chin gently to the top of Orion's small soft head. The baby made a sound that wasn't crying. Something smaller. Something content. But down the hall, Driven had stopped walking. He stood in the corridor for a moment, hand against the wall. Because the note had said, "I think I can feed him. I don't know how to explain it, but I think my body already started." And Driven, who had built an empire on knowing which variables changed everything, understood that something had just shifted. He just didn't know yet how far. He pulled out his phone, sent a single text. Not to Mira, to Cedric. The message said, "Run a full background on the kitchen Omega. Everything." Cedric's reply came in 4 seconds. Already started. The estate had a particular silence at 7 in the morning. Not peaceful. Not quiet in the way that meant rest. It was the silence of a house where people were already awake and already working and already careful. The kind of silence that formed around powerful men the way weather forms around mountains. Caliph had learned to read it in his first week here. He'd learned that when the East Corridor was empty before 8, it meant Driven hadn't left his office yet, which meant something was being decided. He'd learned that the kitchen staff moved faster when Valor was on the lower floors and slower when Cedric was. He'd learned which guards spoke to each other and which ones didn't, and what that meant about trust and hierarchy in a place where trust was the rarest resource of all. 7 months of watching. 7 months of listening with everything except words. Kept him safe. But right now, sitting in Myra's small exam room off the nursery corridor, safe felt like a distant concept. Mira closed the door, turned, looked at him the way a professional looks at a situation that has moved outside their training. "I need to ask you something," she said. "And I need you to be honest with me. Not for my sake. For his." Caliph held his notepad ready. "Have you experienced anything like this before? With any infant? Any child?" He thought, then wrote, "No. Any changes in your body over the past few weeks? Physical changes?" He hesitated. That was enough. "Okay," Mira said carefully. She set her clipboard down, sat across from him, dropped the professional distance for a moment. "What I'm about to tell you is medically unusual. That doesn't mean it's impossible. It means it's rare, and it means I need to understand what we're working with before I say anything to the kings." She paused. "Does that make sense?" Caliph nodded. "There is a documented phenomenon, uncommon but real, in which omega physiology can respond to a strong scent bond with an infant, particularly in cases where there's biological proximity. The body doesn't always distinguish between biological parentage and deep scent compatibility." She chose her next words deliberately. "Under the right conditions, an omega's body can begin to respond. Hormonally, physically." She watched his face. "Has that been happening?" Caliph's pen moved slowly. "I thought it was stress. I didn't know what it meant." Mira was quiet for a moment. "When did it start?" "For days after I arrived in this wing." She picked up her clipboard again, made a note, then looked at him steadily. "I'm not going to ask you to do something you're not comfortable with. Whatever you decide stays your decision." She paused. "But if what I think is happening is real, then you may be the only person who can feed him in a way his body will accept. And right now he needs to eat." The door opened behind her. All 3 of them came in. Driven first, then Cedric, then Valor, who filled the doorway in a way that made the already small room feel half its size. They were dressed suits, all 3, which meant they'd already been working, which meant they'd been briefed, which meant Driven had made a decision before he came in here. Caliph kept his hands flat on his thighs and looked at none of them directly. Valor spoke first. "This is a joke. Not a question. Not hostile. Just disbelief. Loud, flat disbelief. He's a kitchen worker, Dri. He's not. This isn't." "Valor." Driven's voice. That was all. Just his name. Valor stopped. Cedric moved to the side of the room. He had his tablet. He had the expression he wore when he had already run the numbers and was waiting for everyone else to catch up. Dreven looked at Caliph. Mira explained the situation to you. Caliph nodded. And you're willing? Another nod. Slower. More careful. Dreven was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that meant he was calculating. Not cruelty, not dismissal. Just the weight of a man who understood that every decision in a house like this created consequences in 3 directions at once. I want to be clear with you, he said. This doesn't change your position here. You are not being asked to take on a role you didn't sign on for. You can say no. He paused. But if you say yes, I will make sure you have everything you need. And I will make sure you're protected. Protected. That word landed differently than Dreven probably intended it to, because for a moment, Calith's face shifted. Something moved under the composure, something old and reflexive, and then it was gone. He wrote on the notepad, handed it to Dreven. He's already mine in the way that matters right now. I'm not going to let him go hungry. Valor read over Dreven's shoulder. He looked at Caliph for the first time like he was actually seeing him. You said already mine, Valor said, quieter now. What does that mean? Caliph wrote. It means I hear him cry and my body responds before my brain does. I don't have a better explanation. Valor looked at Cedric. Cedric looked at his tablet. That language, Cedric said slowly, describes a primary bond response. Not a caretaker response. Not a nurse's instinct. He set the tablet down. It describes what a biological parent describes. Silence. Real silence. The kind that follows a sentence that rearranges the architecture of a room. Valor said, That's not possible. We used a donor program. The records. I know what the records say, Cedric interrupted. I've been pulling them for the last 6 hours. He looked at Dreven. There are gaps. Significant ones. Specifically in the donor intake files from the pre-approval phase. Dreven looked at Caliph. How long were you in the medical assistance program? Caliph went very still. His pen didn't move. Because that question, that specific question, should not have been possible for Dreven Vale to ask. Because Caliph had never told anyone about the program, had never mentioned it, had buried it the same way he buried everything he needed to survive. His eyes moved to Cedric's tablet. Cedric held it up slightly, just enough to confirm. They already knew. Caliph looked at the door for exactly 1 second. Old instinct, old training. And then he looked back at Dreven because running was a thing he'd done enough of. He wrote, handed it across. 2 years. I was told it was a health study. I was never told what they were studying. Dreven held the note for a long time. Then he handed it to Cedric without a word. Cedric read it. Set it on the desk. Opened a file on his tablet. The program was called Meridian Health Partners, Cedric said. It ran for 3 years. 16 Omega participants. They were recruited through low-income health clinics across the eastern seaboard. He paused. It was funded through a shell subsidiary of the Syndicate Council's medical portfolio. I never approved that, Dreven said. No, Cedric agreed. You didn't. Another silence. Longer this time. Valor's jaw was tight. And Caliph sat very still in his chair, this quiet, mute, invisible kitchen Omega, with the understanding that the thing he'd spent years trying to forget had followed him here, had found him, not through punishment, through a child, through a small sleeping boy in a crib down the hall who had cried for 9 days straight and stopped only when held against Calith's chest. Mira appeared in the doorway. She'd stepped out to check on the nursery. He's awake, she said. And he's starting to get agitated. Everyone heard it then. The distant sound of the crying beginning again, and Caliph was already standing. But before he left the room, Cedric spoke. There's something else in the file. He didn't look up from the tablet. The program. The participants. A pause. The intake records listed donor compatibility scores. The highest score recorded, across all 16 participants, belonged to a 22-year-old male Omega. He looked up. Caliph. The file doesn't have a name. It was redacted. Another pause. But the sent profile markers match your blood work from your estate employment screening. The crying down the hall got louder. Caliph left the room, and the three kings stood in silence with what Cedric had just said sitting between them like something none of them had been prepared to carry. The first time Caliph fed Orion, nobody was in the room. That was Myra's decision. She'd looked at the three kings, at Vaylor's tension and Cedric's calculations and even Dreven's careful, controlled stillness, and she'd said plainly, "Give him privacy." And somehow, without argument, they had. The door closed. Mira dimmed the lights, set a blanket across the armchair, made sure the room was warm, and then she left too. Just Caliph, just Orion, just the harbor light coming through the tall windows, moving slow and gray across the floor. Orion was crying again. Not the violent, desperate kind from the first 9 days, but the urgent kind. The kind that said, "I know what I need and I need it now." A different quality entirely. More specific. More directed. Directed at Caliph. Caliph sat down. Held him. Let the instinct move through his body the way Mira had said it would. His body already knew. She told him, "You've been responding for days, you just didn't have a name for it," and waited. Orion quieted. Found what he was looking for. Began to eat. And Caliph pressed his face against the baby's soft hair and breathed. Just breathed. Because something settled in his chest that he didn't have a word for. Not peace. He'd been without peace for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like. Something else. Something more immediate. The simple, physical reality of being needed by something small and real and alive. He sat there for 40 minutes. When Mira knocked softly and opened the door, Orion was asleep again. Deeply. The good kind of sleep, the heavy-limbed, trusting kind. "How does he look?" she asked. Caliph wrote, "Like he's been waiting for this since he was born." Mira looked at the baby. Something moved through her expression that she didn't try to hide. "His color's already better," she said quietly. "His heart rate's been dropping steadily for the past half hour. That's the parasympathetic response. His body's relaxing." She made a note on her clipboard, then stopped, set the clipboard down. "How are you?" Nobody asked Caliph that. Not ever. He looked at her for a moment, then wrote, "Strange, but okay." Strange how? Like I've been carrying something heavy for a long time, and someone just told me that's what it was for. Mira was quiet for a moment. "You should sleep too," she said. "There's a room next to this one. I had it prepared this morning. You don't have to go back to the kitchen quarters." Caliph looked up. "Mr. Vale's instruction," she added. "Not which one." "Just Mr. Vale." He nodded slowly, but he didn't move yet, because there was something he needed to think through, some calculation that his mind kept returning to, and he needed the quiet and the weight of Orion in his arms to think it clearly. He'd been in the Meridian program. He knew that. He'd known it the moment Cedric said the name, though the word known was complicated. He'd participated in what he'd been told was a health study. He'd signed forms he'd been given no time to read. He'd shown up to a clinic every few weeks for 18 months, answered questions, given samples, and then been told the program was concluding and he could go. He'd been 22. He'd been desperate in the way that people are desperate when the options are narrow and the world is large, and someone in a clean coat hands you a form and says this will help people and you have no reason yet to know how the world works. He hadn't known what they were doing. But now, holding a child whose body knew his scent the way a compass knows north, he had a shape for it, an outline. The thing he couldn't name for 2 years had edges now. And it was terrifying. Not because of the child. Because of who the child belonged to. Down the hall, the three kings were still in Myra's exam room. Caliph could hear fragments, not words, just cadence. Valer's voice rising and being cut short. Cedric steady and low. Driven saying almost nothing. He knew enough about powerful men to know that silence from the most powerful one in the room usually meant something was already decided. The talking was performance. The quiet was the plan. The question was, what was he part of? Mira had said he had a choice. Driven had said he had a choice. But choices were different things depending on who was offering them. He looked at Orion. The baby's face in sleep was purely open. No awareness of kingdoms or bloodlines or who controlled what. No awareness of the weight of the name Vale or the things it cost people to be adjacent to that name. Just sleep. Just trust. Just the body's simple, honest decision about where it felt safe. Caliph wrote a note to himself, which he did sometimes, not for anyone else, just for the record that existed inside the small pages of his spiral pad. If he's mine, then I don't leave, whatever that costs. He looked at it for a moment, tore it out, folded it, put it in his pocket. By evening, the entire estate had shifted. Not dramatically, not in ways that could be pointed to, but the air was different, the particular atmospheric pressure of a large house rearranging itself around a new fact. The kitchen staff knew something had happened. They always did. The guards on rotation spoke to each other in shorter sentences. Mira had moved with quiet efficiency all day, reorganizing the nursery schedule, updating the medical notes, saying nothing specific to anyone. And the baby had eaten twice more. Each time, same result. Immediate calm, deep sleep, color returning to his cheeks. At 6 in the evening, Cedric appeared in the nursery doorway. He did not come in. He stood there, tablet in hand, and looked at Caliph in the armchair with Orion. He looked for long enough that it wasn't accidental. Caliph looked back. Cedric's expression was the same as it always was. Calibrated. Analytical. The face of a man who processed information and returned conclusions. The blood work results came back, Cedric said. He kept his voice low. Caliph waited. The genetic markers are not ambiguous. He paused. You are a biological contributor to this child. Another pause. Not a partial match. A direct one. Caliph had known this was coming. He'd known it the way you know a storm is coming before the sky changes. Not because you see it yet, but because you've stood in enough storms to know the feeling of the air before one hits. He wrote on the notepad, held it up. Does Driven know yet? Yes. And Cedric looked at him for a long moment. He wants to speak with you. Tonight. He looked at the sleeping baby. After Orion's next feeding. He left. Caliph sat with that. The harbor lights were starting to come on outside. One by one, the way they always did at this hour. Little fires across the water, each one separate, each one part of a pattern. He rocked Orion gently. The baby sighed in sleep. And Caliph thought about the word tonight and what it would mean to sit across a table from the eldest Vale King and discuss the fact that through no choice of his own, through exploitation and deception and someone else's plan, this child was connected to both of them. He thought about Valer's reaction. He thought about Cedric's. He thought about what happened to people who became inconvenient truths inside houses built on power. He looked at Orion. The baby's hand opened and closed in sleep. Tiny. Purposeful. Caliph adjusted his hold. He was not going to run. But he ordered Mira quietly, via notepad, to be in the building when he had that conversation. Just in case. And then he waited. What he didn't know, what none of them knew yet, was that Cedric had made a second call that afternoon. Not to the family physician. Not to the estate legal team. To someone outside the estate entirely. Someone connected to the syndicate council. And that conversation had lasted 11 minutes. And at the end of it, whoever was on the other end of that call had said 3 words that Cedric had not repeated to his brothers. Not yet. The call had said, "We need confirmation." Cedric had written it down. Exact words. He wrote everything down. It was a habit born from years of understanding that the gap between what was said and what was remembered was where empires came apart. He closed the note, locked it, and went to find his brothers. They met in Driven's study, the one on the south side of the penthouse with no windows, by design, not accident. A room built for conversations that didn't need witnesses. The desk was large and empty except for a single folder. The folder had been there since morning. Driven stood behind it. Valor sat across from him, arms crossed, leg moving. That restless energy he could never fully contain, especially in rooms where the situation required stillness. Cedric closed the door. The council reached out, he said. Driven's eyes moved to him. When? This afternoon. While you were with Mira. About the Omega. About the program, Cedric corrected. He came further into the room. Stayed standing. They know the blood work was run. They want to know the result before we do anything with it. The silence that followed had weight. Valor's legs stopped moving. How do they know we ran blood work? Because someone in this estate is reporting to them. Another silence. Different kind. Driven opened the folder. Slid a single printed document to the center of the desk. The Meridian program, he said. I've been reading the original charter documents for the past 4 hours. He didn't look up. The program was operational for 38 months. Funded through 4 separate shell accounts, all traceable back to the council's offshore medical subsidiary. 16 participants recruited. Genetic material harvested under the premise of health study enrollment. His voice was completely even. The kind of even that came from a decision already made. None of the participants were told the actual purpose. Valor leaned forward. How many of those participants? 15 had incompatible yields. Viable but not matched to our specific genetic line. Driven closed the folder. One was a perfect match. Nobody said the name. They all knew the name. The program was designed, Driven continued, to produce an heir with a specific biological profile. Not just veil genetics. Not just alpha dominance markers. He looked at Cedric. Tell him the rest. Cedric set his tablet on the desk. The heir was designed to carry a combined genetic profile. Alpha dominant through the veil bloodline, Omega adaptive through the match donor. The combination was theoretical. The council believed it would produce a child with a uniquely stable alpha signature. Dominant enough to inherit control of the syndicate's political infrastructure. He paused. But also emotionally stable in a way that pure alpha lines rarely are. The Omega genetic contribution was specifically selected for emotional resilience. Psychological groundedness. Valor stared at him. They engineered our son. They engineered an heir, Cedric corrected. Whether he becomes a son depends on decisions that were not theirs to make. The room was very quiet. Driven pressed both hands flat on the desk. Controlled. Precise. The council's interest in Caliph is not concern for his welfare, he said. They want to know if the match is confirmed so they can determine whether to retrieve him or neutralize the variable. Valor stood up. Retrieve him. Sit down. They want to take him. Valor. Driven's voice didn't change volume. It didn't need to. Sit down. Valor sat, but his eyes were not calm. They consider him a loose end, Driven continued. They never anticipated the donor surviving the program's closure. The participants were relocated. Records were erased. But Caliph didn't disappear the way they expected. He looked at the folder. He ended up here, through placement channels that I now believe were not accidental. Cedric nodded. Someone moved him here intentionally. The employment file was created 6 weeks before the program officially closed, which means someone with knowledge of the program was already positioning him in proximity to this estate before Orion was conceived. Who? Valor asked. That's what I'm working on, Cedric said. What do we tell the council? Driven looked at the door. then back at his brothers. "Nothing," he said. "We tell them nothing until we know who placed him here and why." He picked up the folder, set it aside, stood straight. "And in the meantime, nothing changes in the nursery. He stays. Orion needs him, and right now that is the only variable that matters." He moved toward the door. "But I want surveillance on the estate staff starting tonight. Quietly. Whoever is reporting to the council does not know that we know. Let's keep it that way." He left. Cedric looked at his tablet for a moment. Valor looked at the empty space where Driven had been standing. "He's protecting the Omega," Valor said. Cedric didn't respond. "I mean, Dree is protecting him. That's what that was." "Protecting Orion," Cedric said. Valor looked at him. "The same thing right now," Cedric said simply, and followed Driven out. Valor sat alone in the study for a moment. He thought about the nursery, about the small quiet man in the armchair who wrote his thoughts on a notepad because his voice didn't work, who'd walked into the nursery without being asked and held the air of the most powerful syndicate on the eastern seaboard and just quieted him, without strategy, without agenda, who'd written, "I won't let him go hungry," who'd written, "He just needed someone who wasn't afraid of him." Valor leaned forward and put his face in his hands. He stayed like that for 1 minute. Then he stood, straightened his jacket, and walked out of the study, down the hall, toward the nursery. He stopped in the doorway. Caliph was awake, Orion asleep across his forearm, and the harbor lights were moving across both of them in the dark. Caliph heard him, turned slightly, looked at him with those open, watchful eyes. Valor stood there for a moment. Then, "Can I sit?" Caliph looked surprised for a second. Then he gestured to the rocking chair beside him. Valor pulled it close. They sat in silence for a while, the impulsive, volatile youngest king and the mute Omega from the kitchen, and watched Orion sleep between them. After a while, Valor spoke, quiet, stripped of the bravado. "I didn't know about the program." Caliph nodded. "None of us did." Caliph reached for his notepad, wrote, handed it over. Valor read it. "I know." He handed the notepad back. Caliph had written, "I believe you." Valor looked at the baby. And then, in the way that people say true things when the lights are low and the room is quiet and there's a sleeping child who makes honesty feel necessary. "He looks like he belongs here," Valor said softly. Caliph looked at Orion. Then he looked at Valor, and wrote. Valor read it. He read it again. His jaw worked. He handed it back. Because the note said, "He does. The question is whether all of us are willing to call it what it is." And Valor didn't have an answer to that yet. Neither did Caliph. But outside the estate, somewhere in the city, a secure line had just connected. And the voice on one end said 4 words. "The Omega is confirmed." And the voice on the other end said, "Then move quickly." What they were moving toward, what they planned to do with that confirmation, was something none of the men inside the Vale penthouse yet understood. But the clock had started, and Orion slept through all of it, small and trusting, in the arms of someone the world had tried to erase. The envelope arrived at 6:47 in the morning. No return address, no postage mark, hand-delivered to the estate's private mail intake, which meant someone had gotten past the perimeter security, past the front desk, past the 3-layer clearance system that Valor had spent 2 years building. And they'd done it quietly enough that not a single camera caught a face. Just an envelope, white, thin, sitting on Driven's desk when he arrived at his study with his coffee. He didn't open it right away. He stood across the room and looked at it for a full 30 seconds. Because men who've survived as long as Driven Vale had don't pick up things that arrive without explanation. Not before they've thought about what it costs to be wrong. He called Cedric. Cedric came in, gloved, and opened it. Inside, a single photograph, printed in black and white, grainy, like it had been pulled from an older file, a surveillance image, maybe, or a medical intake scan. But the subject was clear. It was Caliph, younger, maybe 21, standing in a fluorescent-lit corridor, wearing a paper medical gown, holding a clipboard. His eyes were down. He looked thin. He looked like someone who had been told to wait and had learned how to wait without any visible trace of impatience or resistance. Behind him, barely visible, a sign on the wall. Meridian Health Partners, Intake Corridor C. Cedric turned the photograph over. On the back, handwritten in small, precise letters. He remembers more than he's told you. Ask him about the second clinic. That was all. Cedric set it on the desk. Both men looked at it. Someone inside the council sent this, Driven said. Or someone who wants us to believe they're inside the council, Cedric answered. What's the difference? The difference is motive. Cedric picked up the photograph again, studied the background. If it's the council, they're warning us, which means they're afraid of what Caliph knows. He paused. If it's someone else, someone trying to use us against the council, then this is bait. Driven was quiet. Either way, he said finally, we need to talk to him, not a question. But before either of them could move, a sound came through the intercom on the desk. Myra's voice, controlled but tight. Mr. Vale, I need you in the nursery wing. Now. Driven was already moving. The problem was not Orion. Orion was fine. More than fine. He was awake and alert and making small satisfied sounds from the crib in a way that none of them had heard before the past week. His weight was up. His color was good. Myra's medical notes from the morning read like a different child than the one who'd been admitted to her care 9 days ago. The problem was the man standing in the nursery doorway. He was not estate staff. He was wearing a gray suit, well cut, expensive without trying to look expensive. The specific kind of tailoring that said old money and institutional access. He had a badge clipped to his jacket. Not a police badge, a medical credential. He was talking to one of the rotating nurses. Calmly, the way a man talks when he believes his presence is not something anyone will question. He was asking to see Orion, and he was asking where the caretaker was. Driven walked into the corridor and the man stopped talking immediately. He turned, smiled. Mr. Vale, I'm Dr. Aldrich Fenshaw. I've been retained by the Syndicate Council's Medical Oversight Committee to conduct a routine welfare check on the air. Driven looked at him for exactly 2 seconds. Show me the authorization. A pause. Just a beat too long. The authorization was transmitted digitally this morning. I believe your staff received. No one received anything, Cedric said, appearing behind Driven with his tablet already open. Our intake system has no record of any communication from the Council's medical committee in the past 72 hours. Dr. Fenshaw's smile didn't move, but something behind it did. There may have been a clerical delay. There was no delay, Driven said. You arrived without authorization. You accessed a restricted wing without clearance. And you're asking for access to my son and his caretaker. He took a single step forward. So I'm going to ask you one more time. Who sent you? The corridor was very still. 2 of Valer's guards had appeared at the far end without being signaled. That was the thing about Valer's security. They read the room and moved before they were asked to. Dr. Fenshaw looked at the guards, then back at Driven. The smile finally dropped. The council is going to want answers, he said. Quieter now. The diplomat's voice replaced by something more honest. About the Omega. About the match. About what you plan to do with the information. He paused. They sent me to assess the situation before it becomes a problem they have to manage from a distance. Tell them, Driven said, that there is no situation, and that the next person who enters this wing without authorization will not leave the building through the front door. He held the man's gaze. Fenshaw left. Valer's guards walked him out personally. Driven turned to Cedric. Double the perimeter rotation. Tonight. Then he turned and walked into the nursery. Caliph was in the armchair. He'd heard everything. His face was very still, the specific stillness of someone who had learned to show nothing when they were calculating everything. Orion was awake in his arms, fingers wrapped around Caliph's thumb. Driven came in and closed the door. He sat down across from Caliph. Not the desk across. The real across. Pulled a chair close and sat in it like a man who was done having conversations from a position of height. He placed the photograph on the arm of Caliph's chair. Caliph looked at it. His face did not change, but his hand, the one not holding Orion, pressed flat against his thigh. Driven said nothing. He waited, because Caliph had survived things by reading rooms, and right now the room was saying, "This man is not a threat. This man is trying to understand." And giving people like Caliph the time to arrive at that conclusion themselves was the only thing that worked. Finally, Caliph reached for his notepad. He wrote for longer than usual. He handed it to Driven. Driven read it, then read it again. He looked up at Caliph. Caliph looked back. Steady, open, tired in a way that had nothing to do with sleep. The note said, "There was a second clinic. I didn't know what it was at the time. I was told it was a follow-up appointment. Different location, different doctors. They took more samples. They asked different questions. About family history, about emotional response, about what I wanted in life if I could choose anything. I thought it was a psychological component of the study. I didn't know it was a selection process. I didn't know they were choosing." Driven set the note down slowly. "Choosing for what?" Caliph wrote one line. "For compatibility. For the heir they were already planning." The harbor outside the window had gone silver with morning cloud cover. Orion made a small sound. Neither man moved. And somewhere below the estate, in a car that had just cleared the perimeter gate, Dr. Aldrich Fenshaw lifted a phone to his ear. He said 3 words. "The bond is real." And the line went quiet. And then the voice on the other end said something that made Fenshaw press himself back against the seat. And the car kept driving. Into the city. Toward wherever the council held its meetings. And none of the men inside the Vale penthouse knew what had just been set into motion. Not yet. The results were not supposed to exist. That was the first thing Cedric said when he laid the documents on Driven's desk that evening. Not, "Here's what we found." Not, "You need to see this." Just, these documents were not supposed to exist. Which was different. Which meant someone had kept them deliberately. Had hidden them somewhere the council's erasure teams couldn't reach. Which meant someone, at some point, had anticipated exactly this moment. The file was 41 pages. Cedric had spent the afternoon reading every one. Driven sat across from him. Vaylor stood by the window. The harbor outside had gone dark, and the city lights were up, and the penthouse felt smaller than usual, the way rooms shrink when the information inside them is too large for the space. "The Meridian program," Cedric began, "was authorized by 3 members of the Syndicate Council. Not all 7. 3. He opened to a marked page. "Their names are in the original approval memo. Jericho Aldane, Councilman Price, and a 3rd signatory listed only as the architect." He paused. "That name appears 12 times in this file. Never with a face. Never with a title beyond that. Someone was running the program from the inside without attribution," Driven said. "More than running it." Cedric turned another page. "Designing it. The architect's notes are throughout the file, in the margins, in the methodology appendix, in the donor selection criteria. Whoever this person is, they understood Omega genetics at a level that's not standard training. They knew exactly what combination they were building." He looked up. "And they built contingencies." "What kind of contingencies?" Vaylor asked. Cedric looked at him directly. "They placed Caliph here." Silence. "The employment file," Cedric continued. "The one that appeared 6 weeks before the program closed. I traced it back through the placement network. It came from a non-profit employment agency called Solace Path. He paused. Solace Path was founded 11 years ago by a woman named Dr. Amara One. She was a neonatal specialist. She worked in early Omega health advocacy. Another pause. She was also, for a period of 2 years, a consultant for Meridian Health Partners. Vaylor turned from the window. She placed him here on purpose. She placed him here because she knew what was coming, Cedric said. She knew the heir was going to be born. She knew the biological match existed. And she put Caliph inside this estate because she understood that if the council's plan worked and the child was born, Caliph would be the only person on the planet whose presence could stabilize the heir. She was protecting him, Dreven said. She was protecting both of them, Cedric said. The child and the donor. He closed the file. She calculated that if Caliph was already embedded in the estate, already trusted, already invisible, the council couldn't remove him without explaining why, without admitting what the program was. The room was very quiet. Vaylor said, "Where is she now?" Cedric's jaw tightened. Slightly. Just enough. She died 14 months ago. Listed as a cardiac event. He paused. She was 51. Nobody said anything. Nobody had to. Dreven stood, moved to the window, looked at the city below. The lights, the harbor, the distance between this floor and the street. The council knows all of this, he said. Yes. And Fenshaw coming here this morning was an assessment. They wanted to know if we'd made the connection. If we understood what we were holding. Cedric folded his hands on the desk. We do now. Dreven turned. Then we move first. He said it the way he said everything. Quietly, without drama, with the particular weight of a man whose decisions had always had consequences that reached further than the room he was standing in. We call an emergency session with the full council. All 7 members. Not 3. All 7. He looked at Cedric. We present the file, in full, which means the 3 who approved the program have to sit in a room while the other 4 learn what was done in the syndicate's name without their knowledge. Vaylor exhaled. That's a war. That's accountability, Dreven said. And it's the only thing that protects Caliph. Because once the full council knows, once the information is in that room, the 3 who approved the program lose the ability to act quietly. He paused. Quiet is the only tool they have. Cedric nodded slowly. Vaylor looked at the file on the desk. And Caliph? Does he know about the session? Not yet, Dreven said. Tonight I'm going to speak with him. He moved toward the door. And this time I'm going to tell him everything. He paused with his hand on the doorframe. He deserves to know what was done to him before we use it. He left. Vaylor looked at the file for a moment, then at Cedric. Dr. One, he said. She placed him here because she knew. But how did she know the heir was going to be born here? To us? Cedric looked at him. Because, he said slowly, the architect chose our bloodline specifically, and the architect knew everything about this family. He paused, which means the architect had access to information that only someone very close to this family would have. Vaylor went very still. How close? Cedric didn't answer immediately. He picked up the file, turned to the back page, the one he hadn't shown Dreven yet, the one with the 3rd signatory's handwriting. He held it up. Vaylor looked at it. His face changed. Not shock. Something slower and more damaging than shock. The particular expression of a person who has just watched something they trusted become something else entirely. He looked at Cedric. Cedric said, We don't tell Dreven tonight. He needs to be steady for the conversation with Caliph. And for the council session. He held the page. Tomorrow. We tell him tomorrow. Vaylor looked at the page one more time. Then at his brother. Okay, he said quietly, and he left, and Cedric sat alone with the file. and the handwriting on the back page. And the name beneath it, a name that changed everything. Driven knocked on the nursery door at 9. He never knocked, not in his own estate, but tonight he did, a single quiet rap, and waited. Mira opened it, looked at him, read his face the way she'd learned to read all three of them over 4 years. She nodded once and left without a word. Caliph was in the armchair. Orion was asleep in the crib. A real sleep, deep and even. The kind of sleep the estate hadn't heard from this room in 9 days before Caliph arrived. Driven came in, sat down. He had no file with him, no tablet, no prepared speech, just himself in a chair, in a room that smelled like warm milk and harbor air. He started talking. He told Caliph everything. The Meridian program, the council approval, the donor selection process, and what the second clinic had actually been. Dr. Amara won, and what she'd done, and what it had cost her. The photograph delivered that morning. Fenshaw, the emergency council session that was being arranged. All of it. He talked for 20 minutes. And Caliph sat and listened with his notepad in his lap and his hands still, and his face did the thing it did when he was absorbing information that was too large to react to immediately. Went very quiet, like still water, like the surface of something deep. When Driven finished, he sat back. Waited. Caliph looked at Orion for a long moment. Then he picked up his pen. He wrote, handed it across. Driven read, "She knew he would need me. Dr. 1. Yes. She never told me. She couldn't. If you'd known what you were being placed near, you'd have been a liability to her plan and a target for the council." Driven paused. "She needed you to arrive here the same way you arrived, without knowing. So you'd be already inside before anyone thought to look." Caliph wrote, "She protected me by keeping me in the dark." Yes. A pause. That's a complicated thing to feel grateful for. Driven looked at him. "I know." Caliph looked at the crib. Orion breathed in the quiet. Then Caliph wrote something longer. He took his time. The pen moved carefully. He handed it across. Driven read it. He read it again. He folded it, pressed it flat, set it on his knee. The note said, "I need to know something, not as a security decision, not as a council problem. I need to know as the person who has been feeding your son for a week and who is not going to stop regardless of what you decide. I need to know what you want, not what you're going to do politically, what you want. Because I've been in rooms my whole life where what I was mattered to people only in terms of what I was useful for. And I can't do that again. So if that's what this is, if I'm a resource you're managing, tell me now and I'll make different decisions. But if I'm something else, then I need to hear you say it." Driven sat with that for a long moment. The city was quiet outside. It never actually went quiet, some hum always remained, but this particular hour had a low frequency to it, a pause before the next thing. He looked at the crib, at Orion, the heir his house had built without asking, without consent. The child who had cried for 9 days and stopped the moment he was held by a person who had been used as a means to an end and never told why. He looked at Caliph. "You're not a resource," he said. "You're the person my son chose." He paused. "That carries weight in this house." Caliph looked at him. "More weight than I've said out loud." Driven continued. "Because I've spent 48 hours watching Valor sit next to you in that nursery like he's never felt calm before. Watching Cedric run himself into the ground trying to build a case that keeps you protected. Watching my son." He stopped, steadied. "My son breathe like the world is safe when you're holding him." He looked at the notepad in Caliph's hands. "I'm not managing you. I'm trying to figure out how to ask you something I don't have clean language for yet." Caliph wrote, "Then take your time." Something moved across Driven's face. Small, controlled, but real. "Stay," he said finally. "Not as staff. Not as a caretaker we've categorized. Stay because Orion needs you here and because I think—" He paused. "I think we do too." Caliph looked at him for a long time. Then he wrote, I already decided that. Weeks ago. I just needed to know you knew the difference between keeping me and wanting me here. Driven read it. He nodded once. And they sat in the quiet together, the Mafia King and the mute Omega, with the sleeping air between them, and the weight of everything that had been said settling into the room like something that intended to stay. But across the estate at the same moment, 3 things were happening. 1. Cedric was on a secure line with the council's legal liaison, arranging the emergency session. 2. Valor was in the security room reviewing the morning's perimeter footage, looking for how Fenshaw had gotten in. 3. A second envelope had arrived. This one not for Driven. For Caliph. Mira found it tucked under the nursery door. She held it and looked at it for a moment. Then she walked down the hall and knocked. The envelope had one line inside. Mira had not opened it. She handed it to Caliph sealed because it had his name on the outside in handwriting she didn't recognize, and she understood, in the way she'd always understood things in this house, that some information needed to land directly. Caliph opened it. Read it. Set it on his knee. Driven was still in the room. He saw the change in Caliph's face, that specific stillness, and he waited. Caliph handed him the note. One line. Handwritten. No signature. The architect is still watching. And the architect wants you to know. The program was never finished. The room did not move. Driven read it twice. He set it on the side table. Carefully. The way you set something down when you want your hands to be free. He pulled out his phone. Sent one text to Cedric. Come to the nursery. He came in 2 minutes. Read the line. His expression didn't change, but his eyes moved to Driven's face and stayed there. The session, Driven said. Tomorrow morning, Cedric confirmed. 8 o'clock. Move it to tonight. Cedric looked at him. Tonight. Whatever time they can convene. We are not waiting until morning. Cedric nodded. Left. Caliph had been watching all of this. His notepad was on his knee. He picked up his pen. He wrote, What does never finished mean? Driven sat back. It means there may be others, he said. Other participants from the program. Other children conceived without consent through the meridian process. He paused. Or it means the council intended a second phase, and we've interrupted it. Caliph wrote. Or it means the person who designed this hasn't gotten what they wanted yet. Driven looked at him. Yes, he said. Or that. Caliph looked at Orion. The baby was awake now, making quiet sounds, hands moving in the slow, purposeful way of infants who are learning that their hands exist. He was not crying. He hadn't cried in days. Caliph reached into the crib and let Orion's fingers close around his thumb. He wrote one-handed. What do you need from me for tonight? Driven looked at him for a moment. Then, nothing. You stay here. You keep him calm. That's the most important thing that happens in this estate tonight. And if the council decides, they won't decide anything about you, Driven said. Flat. Final. The voice that ended rooms. He stood. I promise you that. He left. And Caliph sat with Orion and the quiet and the note still sitting on the side table and the weight of that word, promise, which was a thing he'd stopped believing in years ago but which, in Driven Vale's voice, had a different texture than it usually did. He pressed his thumb gently into Orion's grip. The baby held on. The council session convened at 11:15. All 7 members. In the syndicate's private chamber 2 floors below the Vale penthouse. A room that looked like a boardroom and functioned like a court. 7 chairs. 7 faces. Some who knew. Some who didn't. Driven stood at the head of the table. He did not sit. He placed the 41-page file at the center of the table. He spoke for 19 minutes without interruption. He laid out the program, the funding, the 3 signatories, the donor recruitment, the erasure of records, Dr. 1, the employment placement, the photograph delivered that morning. Fenshaw's unauthorized visit. All of it. When he finished, the room was the kind of quiet that precedes a structure coming apart. Councilman Price, who was one of the 3 original signatories, said, "The program was authorized for the benefit of the syndicate's long-term leadership continuity." "You used a person," Dreven said. "You used him without his knowledge or consent to produce a child that was then placed in my house without my knowledge or consent." He looked at Price. "And then you sent someone to assess whether that person needed to be removed." Price opened his mouth. "Don't," Dreven said. He didn't shout it. He didn't need to. The other 4 council members, the ones who had not signed, were reading the file. Pages turning. Expressions shifting. One of them, Councilwoman Adiz Okafor, looked up. "The 3rd signatory," she said. "The architect. Who is it?" The room went still. Jericho Aldane, the 1st signatory, looked at the table. Price said nothing. Cedric, standing behind Dreven, said, "We know who it is. We made the decision tonight not to name them in this room because the naming requires due process and we're not the syndicate's court." He paused. "But we have the handwriting. We have the documentation trail. And we will be presenting it to the appropriate internal review body within 48 hours. Adiz looked at Dreven. "And the Omega? The donor?" "He stays in this estate," Dreven said, "under the protection of this family. That is not a council decision." He met her eyes. "That is mine." She held his gaze for a moment. Then she nodded. One by one, the other non-signatory members followed. Price looked at the table. Aldane did not speak for the rest of the session. The meeting ended at 12:42 in the morning. Dreven came back upstairs. He stood in the nursery doorway. Caliph was asleep in the armchair. Orion asleep in the crib. The lamp on the side table still on, casting a low, even light across both of them. Mira had put a blanket over Caliph at some point. Dreven looked at the room for a long moment. Then he reached in and turned the lamp down, and went back to his own room. For the first time in 11 days, the entire estate slept. But at the far end of the city, in a building with no name on the door, a phone buzzed on a desk. A message received. Short. They moved. Faster than expected. The person reading it set the phone down, picked up a pen, wrote something on a notepad, folded it, and began making arrangements. Because the architect did not stop at obstacles. The architect adapted. And the program the architect still believed was not finished. 3 months later, Orion laughed for the first time. It happened on a Tuesday. No occasion. No audience. Just Caliph sitting cross-legged on the nursery floor with the baby propped against a cushion in front of him. Doing the thing he'd started doing in the 3rd week. Pressing his forehead gently against Orion's and making slow, deliberate eye contact. No sound. Just presence. Like a conversation that didn't need words. And Orion, who had spent his first 9 days communicating only in pain, looked at Caliph's face from 3 inches away, and laughed, small and bright, a bubble of sound that had no precedent in that room. Caliph went completely still. The laugh came again, stronger this time. Caliph pressed both hands to his own face. And for the first time since he'd arrived in this estate, since long before that, his eyes filled. He didn't wipe them. He just let them. He'd been invisible for so long that being seen, being chosen over and over by this small person who had no agenda and no interest in strategy, had taken time to land, to become real, to stop feeling like something that could be taken back. But this was real. This laugh was real. He picked Orion up and held him against his chest, and Orion grabbed 2 fistfuls of Caliph's shirt and kept laughing. Dreven heard it from the hallway. He'd been walking past on his way to his study, file in hand, and the sound stopped him. He stood in the corridor for a moment, just listening. He set the file against the wall. He knocked, came in. Saw Caliph on the floor with Orion against his chest, eyes red, the baby making sounds that the penthouse had never heard before. He sat on the floor, right there, on the nursery rug, suit and all. He held out one finger toward Orion. The baby considered it seriously, then reached for it, and held on. Driven looked at his son's face. This face he'd been so determined to solve, to fix, to quiet through force of resources and will. And felt something he hadn't felt since before the empire, before the responsibility, before the weight of everything the Veil name carried. He felt like a father, not a king managing an heir. A father, present, small, outranked by a 6-week-old who had somehow, without saying a single word, reorganized the entire hierarchy of the household. He looked at Caliph. Caliph looked at him. Driven said, "You didn't just keep him alive." He paused. "You made him happy." Caliph looked at the baby. He reached for his notepad, wrote, "Passed it." Driven read, "He made me happy too. I think that's the deal." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's a good deal." Veiler arrived 20 minutes later, because Mira had texted him about the laugh. He came in at a half-run and then stopped when he saw Driven on the floor, looked around the room and then sat down too. Right there. No chair. No distance. Cedric appeared in the doorway. Looked at his 2 brothers on the nursery rug. Looked at Caliph. Looked at Orion, who was now conducting a serious investigation of Driven's watch. He came in. He sat down. For a while, nobody spoke. That was the thing about this room. It had learned a different kind of silence. Not the silence of grief. Not the silence of an estate holding its breath around powerful men. The silence of people who were learning, slowly, how to be still in the same space without it being a performance. Veiler said, "The council review came back yesterday." Driven nodded. "Price and Aldane are out. Formally. The review board is opening a full internal investigation into the Meridian program." Cedric said, "The architect's identity is under seal pending the investigation." He paused. "But the syndicate's legal team confirmed this morning that no further action will be taken against any of the program's participants." Caliph looked at Cedric. Cedric met his eyes. "That means you. And the others, if they're found." He paused. "Dr. Wen's estate has been notified. Her family will be informed of her role, the protective one." He looked at the baby. She was right about him. Nobody asked what he meant. They all knew. She'd been right that Orion would need Caliph. Right that the bond would form. Right that if she placed one person in the right position at the right moment, a machine built on power and cold calculation might accidentally produce something it hadn't planned for. Family. Not a product. Family. Orion got bored with the watch and shifted his attention to Veiler's hand, grabbing at it with both of his own. Veiler let him. Sat still and let this 6-week-old anchor him to the floor of a room he'd spent weeks standing outside of. Caliph watched all 3 of them. He picked up his notepad. He wrote something. He held it up where all 3 could see it. It said, "He chose all of us. I think we should act like it." Driven looked at the note, then at Caliph, then at his son. "Yeah," he said. "Just that." "Yeah." The afternoon light moved across the nursery floor. The harbor was visible through the tall window, silver and wide and going somewhere. Orion made a sound that was almost a word and then wasn't, and everyone in the room leaned in slightly as though they could help it become what it was reaching for. 3 of the most powerful men on the eastern seaboard, sitting on a rug, leaning toward a baby, because that was what the baby required, because the baby had decided. And somewhere in the city, the investigation continued. Files were being reviewed. Names were being confirmed. The architect's identity was moving slowly through sealed corridors toward daylight. But in the nursery, none of that had arrived yet. In the nursery, there was just this. The afternoon. The window. The light. Caliph holding Orion, who had stopped crying the day he found someone who wouldn't leave. The three kings who had walked into that room expecting to solve a problem and ended up being changed by it instead. Power can command a great many things. Cannot command this. Some things only happen when they're chosen. By a child who has no agenda, no strategy, no awareness of what he started. Just arms that knew where to reach. And a laugh that arrived on a Tuesday and changed the room forever. If the story moved you, if you felt every moment Caliph held that baby, if you were gripping your seat when the council session started, if Orion's first laugh hit different, then you already know what this channel is built for. Stories that get into you. Stories that stay. Subscribe and turn on notifications. Because the next story is already coming, and it carries that same quiet power this one did. You don't want to walk into it halfway through. And before you go, leave something in the comments. Tell us, which moment in this story stayed with you the most? Was it the first time the crying stopped? The moment Dreven sat on the nursery floor? Or something smaller that landed in a way you didn't expect? Share it. Because your words inspire other people to keep watching, keep feeling, keep coming back for more. This channel is built on stories that matter. And you're the reason they do.